Okay, so let's start. It seems like a few of you guys have answered done the quiz. I'm just gonna go over it now because I don't think anybody's gonna do it after the class. So if you haven't finished it, then just follow along and I'll just go over it. But so this is our quiz. So the first question: what does the smooth ER do? So if you remember, there was that question that we went over when we were reviewing cell bio, and we said that the smooth ER is involved with the synthesis of lipids. The synthesis of proteins is the rough ER. The synthesis of DNA, that we'll get into later when we get into our genetics unit. And synthesis of ribosomes. If you remember, I talked about the nucleus having those certain regions of DNA, which code for things like ribosomes. So synthesis of ribosomes was not the answer. So the answer to what does the smooth ER do was the synthesis of lipids. Okay, so the next question, what does the rough ER do? So nothing, obviously not. It transports and creates proteins. That's the correct answer. Remember that the rough ER, it kind of spans a large part of the cell. So that's why it's involved with transport. And then it's also on the edge of the nucleus, which is really important. Next one, it contains the molecules necessary to create proteins from DNA. That would be the ribosomes, because remember, ribosomes create turn DNA into protein. And then the final one, it uses sugars to create energy for the cell. That would be the mitochondria. So this image depicts a plant cell. Pretty much all of you guys got this. And remember, that's a plant cell. You can tell because of the giant vacuole in the middle. We said that plants have that giant vacuole. That's really important. And then plant cell walls, which you can see on the end around the cell, is another characteristic thing of plants. And the final thing you can look at is the chloroplast, which is shown here. You can see like it's green, which suggests it's a chloroplast. Okay, so the answer to this was plant cell. So what organelle is depicted by structure 6? So if we look at structure 6, we see that it's pointing to the chloroplast. You can tell it's the chloroplast because it's green. Anything that's kind of like circular like this, or this is also a chloroplast, this is also a chloroplast. You can always tell because it's green. That's pretty much what a chloroplast is. What organelle is depicted by 2? So 2 is here. So as you can see, it's going to be the endoplasmic reticulum, because along the nucleus, and it also spans a large part of the cell, kind of covers all around the nucleus. You can tell it's the rough endoplasmic reticulum because it contains these little dots on the outside, which are the ribosomes, or where the ribosomes are. So that's why this is the rough endoplasmic reticulum. We're now depicted by 4. So 4 is over here, and if you remember, we said that one characteristic of plant cells is that they have the giant, like, fluid-filled sac in the middle of them, and that's called the vacuole. So that was the answer to that question. And then the final one, what is the function of organelle 1? So organelle 1 is here. If you remember, I said that in class, this is a mitochondria, and you can tell because it has these little folds going in and out along the edge of the mitochondria. So that's how you would tell that this is a mitochondria. And the function of the mitochondria is to create energy by converting, or to create energy from carbohydrates and fats. So this would be the answer. Create energy by converting sunlight into sugars is photosynthesis, which is in the chloroplast. That's what we're going to talk about today. To destroy worn down organelles, that is the function of the lysosome. And then finally, to transform DNA into proteins for the cells to use. Remember, that was in a previous question, and that was the ribosome. So if you guys have any questions on what I just said, why are all the... Oh, well, yeah, all the answers to the multiple choice questions are B. That's interesting. Okay, so Let's get into today's lesson. We're going to do photosynthesis. So if you remember last time, we did cell respiration. So that was how the mitochondria takes energy from glucose and converts it into ATPs, which is like the energy currency of the cell, which the cell can then use. So today we're going to be talking about photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is how plants take in energy from the sunlight and create sugars and macromolecules that these organisms can use. So let's start off with how organisms are classified. So organisms can be classified by how they obtain energy and how they obtain carbon. So why carbon? Well, if you remember from our lectures on macromolecules and biochemistry, all of the macromolecules contain carbon, and carbon is something that we look for to suggest organic material. Anything with carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen are considered organic material. So that's why we look at how they obtain carbon. So let's look at their energy source first. So chemotrophs. Chemotrophs can get energy directly from chemical compounds. So most chemotrophs are things like bacteria that will live near hydrothermal vents. Hydrothermal vents are these kind of like volcanoes in the bottom of the ocean. They spew out a lot of gases like sulfuric compounds. So chemotrophs use that sulfur to create energy. The other is phototrophs. Phototrophs create energy from light. These organisms can also use chemical compounds, but their main way of getting energy is from light. Plants are phototrophs. They use the sun to make sugars. Then we have the carbon source. So autotrophs can fix carbon dioxide. And what this means is that they can take the atmospheric carbon and convert it into usable molecules. For example, this is what plants do. Plants take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it into sugars. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, cannot fix CO2. So what they have to do is they have to eat other organisms to get that carbon. So we are heterotrophs. Often, autotrophs are sessile, which means they cannot move, and heterotrophs are motile, which means they can move. The reason for this is because autotrophs have no need to move because they can just take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but heterotrophs have to move around to catch their prey to eat. So combined, you can have four possible groups. You can have photoautotrophs, which carry out photosynthesis, use the sun's energy, and they also take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So green plants, algae, some bacteria are photoautotrophs. Then there's photoheterotrophs. These will use light energy again, but they cannot fix CO2, so they have to go around and eat other organisms to get their carbon. So non-sulfur purple bacteria are examples of photoheterotrophs. Chemoautotrophs obtain energy from organic molecules that they absorb and use some of it to fix CO2. So these are examples of bacteria. And then chemoheterotrophs. They use organic molecules to get energy, and they also need other organisms to eat so they can get those macromolecules. So we are chemoheterotrophs. All animals are chemoheterotrophs. Fungi are chemoheterotrophs, and some protists and bacteria. Okay, so those are like how organisms get energy. We will be talking about photoautotrophs for this lecture, which are just plants, and we'll be talking about photosynthesis. So the next thing that we need to know is we need to know a little bit about light, because what happens is photosynthesis is based completely off light. If you look at the name or the word photosynthesis, photo means light, or photo just means light, and synthesis means like the making of something. So it's the making of something using light. So that's why light is really important to photosynthesis. So we have to see it a little bit. So visible light is a form of electromagnetic radiation. So that just means that visible light is kind of just like a wave, if you will. If you guys have studied a little bit of physical science in your class, you know that the electromagnetic spectrum is like all of the different types of waves based on their wavelengths, and you know how strong they are in some sense. So visible light is kind of in the middle. It's the wavelength that we can see, and that's what plants use for photosynthesis. Plants will use that visible light for photosynthesis. So visible light is actually a very small part of all of the types of electromagnetic radiation. There's like tons of other types. I believe there's 6 others. Plants and humans, we just primarily rely on visible light. So electromagnetic radiation consists of particles, or light in general consists of particles, or packets of energy called photons. You might have heard of this, but these packets of energy, or photons, they are particles, but they travel as waves. And so photons are really important to photosynthesis because it's it's where the energy is stored. So we talk about it a little bit later. These photons will transfer energy to atoms to pretty much give them energy that's going to be used for photosynthesis. So we don't have to talk about this. As I said, the portion of the spectrum visible to humans is the visible light, and it's the high energy light is violet light at 380 nanometers, and 380 nanometers is like the wavelength of the light. So the amount of energy carried is inversely proportional to the wavelength, which just means that if you have like a really small wavelength like you do here, you're going to have a very high energy light, which is what they're showing, high energy violet light at 380 nanometers. But then you can also have lower energy red light at 760 nanometers. So 760 nanometers is double that of 380 nanometers. So red light has half the energy of violet light. And so this visible light is pretty much all the colors of the rainbow. That is what the visible light spectrum is made up of. So now that we know a little bit about light, let's talk about how this light energy is actually converted into energy that the plant and the chloroplast can actually end up using. So what we've discovered is that we've seen that molecules have actually been made to absorb photons in plants. So what this means pretty much is, you know, if you remember from our talk on chemistry, we have an atom which has the nucleus in the center, which is made up of neutrons and protons. But then on the outside, orbiting around the nucleus, you have the electrons. The electrons are negatively charged. So when a molecule, or just an atom in general, absorbs a photon, it becomes energized. And these electrons on the outside are the ones that are taking in the energy. So that's why photons are really, really important, because those are the ones that are actually transferring the energy to the electrons. So, so it depends, or let's talk a little bit about, you know, this electron absorbing energy. So normally electrons are in what we call the ground state, and that's really important. This pretty much means that electrons are kind of just sitting in their orbitals. You remember, they're sitting in their shells. They're not really moving. They're kind of just stable where they are. They're at their lowest possible energy, don't really have much energy. Now, there's something called the excited state. And then the excited state is when a photon hits that atom. And when the photon hits that atom, these electrons gain a lot of energy. And what actually happens is they move farther away from the nucleus. So this is interesting because, like, when an electron is really close to the nucleus, it's in its ground state. When it moves farther away, it gains energy, and it's now in its excited state. So because this electron is now like excited and the atom is excited, it can actually, kind of like fall back if it, loses energy. And when it falls back, it'll actually emit a photon. So this is kind of like a cycle, right? Photon hits the atom, the electron moves from the ground state to the excited state. The electron loses energy, so it falls from the excited state back to the ground state, and this releases energy in the form of photons, which is what we see in fluorescence. So if you've ever seen like those bioluminescent jellyfish, that is due to that that electron falling back to that lower energy level and pretty much releasing energy because it's losing energy and in the form of a photon. And that actually what leads to fluorescence. So even if you've seen a firefly outside before, those use this principle. They power up the electron and it falls back and they're able to release energy. So we'll get back to this principle later, and we'll talk about how these high energy electrons and how this excitation can be used to, make sugars from CO2. Okay, so let's move on to here. So we're going to talk about photosynthesis, overview of photosynthesis, and then the two steps, the light reactions and the dark reactions. Okay, so photosynthesis is when we convert light energy into glucose molecules, which they say here is potential energy, but it also can be chemical energy because it's stored in chemical bonds. So this is the equation, and this is really important to note. The equation is 6 CO2 plus 6 water. And when you add light energy, you perform photosynthesis and you get a glucose molecule and 6 molecules of oxygen gas. Now, this equation is actually really interesting because it's the exact reverse of that of cell respiration. So if you remember, cell respiration with glucose plus 6 oxygen makes water, carbon dioxide, and ATP. So this is the kind of exact reverse. We take in 6 carbon dioxide, we take in water, and we take in the light energy, and we're producing that glucose and that oxygen gas. So pretty much this is the reverse of cell respiration. So as we said, it's carried out by photoautotrophs, mainly plants, some bacteria, and then phytoplankton, which are like the plankton in the ocean. And then we also have the important fact that plants who carry out photosynthesis provide the basis for all ecosystems. So all food energy ultimately comes from the sun, and all O2, because as you can see, the plants release O2 by photosynthesis. This comes from plants. Okay. Okay, so again, let's look at photosynthesis versus respiration. They are the reverse of each other. We said that the chloroplast is the one involved with photosynthesis. Mitochondria are the one involved with cell respiration. And what we see is that sugars from photosynthesis, as well as O2, remember, these are the products of the photosynthesis reaction. Those become the reactants of cell respiration, and they create CO2 and water, which can then be used in photosynthesis to create sugars and O2, and then that's used in cell respiration, and the cycle just goes on and on. So that's why we say carbon dioxide and oxygen are recycled in the atmosphere, because plants will take in the carbon dioxide and animals will take in oxygen, and they will release the opposite as products. So they are pretty much the exact reverse of each other. But what we can also see from this diagram is that the sun is powering the chloroplast, and that's really important. That shows you that the sun is pretty much the basis of all energy on Earth. Okay, so let's look at where chloroplasts are located. So chloroplasts are found in the leaf cells. So if you look at the leaf cross section, what you'll actually see is these kind of like bundles here, which are made up of mesophyll cells. This is called the mesophyll. We won't go too deep into the anatomy of the leaf, but all you need to know is that when you look at a leaf, the photosynthesizing cells are the mesophyll cells. The mesophyll cells contain a lot of chloroplasts. They have a very high concentration of chloroplasts in their cells. So this is where the chloroplast is located. So let's look at the chloroplast itself. So similar to the mitochondria, it has two membranes. So you have the outer membrane right here, just an outer shell. Then you have the inner membrane. We don't really care about the space between the outer and inner membrane. It's not really important. But what is important is that inside the inner membrane, we have like all of how the chloroplasts work. So here you have the stroma. This is the stroma. It's kind of like the matrix of the mitochondria, which is just like the inside. It's like the cytoplasm of the inner part of the chloroplast. It's kind of just where everything floats around. We call that the stroma. Then we have these stacks. You can see these green stacks of discs. These stacks are called grana, G-R-A-N-A. The singular is granum. And this is where the photosynthesis takes place in these granum. So these individual discs are called thylakoids. And the thylakoids stack to make these grana. And the thylakoid is specifically where the photosynthesis takes place. So photosynthesis has two sets of reactions. So you can see here, you have the light reactions, which take place in these thylakoids, but then you also have the Calvin cycle, which is also called the dark reactions, and they take place in the stroma. So the reason this is called the light reactions is because it directly requires sunlight. If you do not have sunlight, then the light reactions will not take place. This is really important. They're also called the light-dependent reactions because they depend on light being there to actually work. The other aspect is the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle is considered the dark reactions. It does not require light. Only the light reactions require light. So looking a little bit more detailed into the light reactions, the main thing that you have to remember about what the light reactions use is water. That's really, really important. They take in the water and they actually split it and they convert it into oxygen gas. So if we look back at the equation for cell respiration, this oxygen does not come from carbon dioxide. These oxygen molecules come from water. A lot of people like to ask that as a question, where does the oxygen gas come from? It always comes from the water. Okay. So then we have the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is what takes in the carbon dioxide and produces the sugars. So similar to how water only produces oxygen, carbon dioxide only produces sugars. Carbon dioxide is not involved with the creation of oxygen, and water is not involved with the creation of sugars. So the main products and reactants of light reactions in Calvin cycle. So the light reactions will create ATP and NADPH. So let's take a trip down memory lane back to when we talked about cell respiration. What we see is actually ATP is being created in the light reactions, but then it's actually being used in the Calvin cycle. So that's like a little odd at first, but we have to remember that the purpose of photosynthesis is to create sugars. We want to create sugars. We don't want to really create ATP, and that's why it's being used back up in the Calvin cycle. We also create NADPH. Notice this is a little bit different from cell respiration. Before, it was NADH. Now it's NADPH. It just has an extra phosphate group. So the light reactions create ATP, NADPH. The Calvin cycle will use up the ATP and NADPH, creating NADP plus and ABP and a phosphate group. And then these molecules are cycled throughout these two cycles. Okay, so let's talk about the light-dependent reactions. They occur in the thylakoid. They occur, you can see, in the membranes of the thylakoid. The light reactions only occur within the thylakoid. They have certain, major, I guess you could say, molecules. So the first major molecule is PS2. I don't know if they talk about it a little later here. Go ahead there. Okay, no, they do talk about it here. Okay, so we won't get into that now. I was going to talk about the molecules and all that, but they talk about that a little bit later. All you have to remember is that the light reactions occur in the thylakoid membrane. If you remember from our talk on cell respiration, we talked about the mitochondria having the electron transport chain. The chloroplasts in the thylakoid membrane also have the electron transport chain. And the reason for this is because they create ATP. And the way we create ATP is always using an electron transport chain. So that's why the light reactions actually use an electron transport chain to make ATP. So let's talk about what actually absorbs light. So depicted in A here, we actually have the electromagnetic spectrum. You see we have gamma rays, X-rays, UV rays, visible light, infrared waves, microwaves, and radio waves. So all of these are types of waves, electromagnetic waves. This is the spectrum of all the waves, but we just look at this little tiny sliver here of visible light. And visible light is, many different wavelengths. So it spans from 400 to 750 nanometers. Little bit of information: radio waves can be over 1 meter long. This diagram, if you can see here, is just depicting that the visible light is in between 400 nanometers and 750 nanometers. Radio waves could be much, much more, and gamma rays are much, much less. So yeah, that's the electromagnetic spectrum, but we really only care about visible light. So now let's talk about what actually absorbs this light. So we have what are called phytopigments. So if you know what pigments are, they're kind of like colorations. So for example, if you have darker skin, then you probably have a higher concentration of a pigment called melanin. And this melanin is what actually makes our skin dark. So in plants, they also have pigments. Their pigments are chlorophyll A and B, which are the major pigments. They also have accessory pigments. They give the example here of carotenoids. You don't really need to know about carotenoids. Just remember that chlorophyll A and B are the major pigments. So this is what we call the absorption spectrum. So the absorption spectrum shows what kind or what color of light these pigments will absorb. So this green line here shows chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A is kind of like the bigger one out of chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Chlorophyll A absorbs pretty much all ranges of light. You can see it absorbs red here, it absorbs blue and violet here, it absorbs some yellow, but the main thing is that it does not absorb green. Chlorophyll A does not absorb green. And you can see that here on the absorption spectrum because you can see the green line kind of has no absorption down here. Chlorophyll B is very similar. It's kind of a bluish green. As you can see here, this is where blue light is. It's present down here. As you can see, it's not absorbing any blue light, and it's also not absorbing any green light. It pretty much mainly absorbs just like yellow light. And then the final one are the carotenoids. Carotenoids are colored orange, and they only absorb blue light and a little bit of green light. So as you can see, that's why plants are colored the way they are, because they don't really absorb any green light. So if they don't absorb it, they reflect it, and that's what we see. So when we actually look outside, we're just seeing green light being reflected off the chlorophyll and the chlorophyll B and the carotenoids because it's not absorbing it. So that's what we see. That's why we see plants as green, because of these pigments. So you can see here, chlorophyll absorbs non-green light energy, and it reflects green light. That's why you can see green light is passing out of the chloroplast, and you can also see that some of the green light is being transmitted through the chloroplast, which just means that it's not being absorbed after it hits. The absorbed light is all of this, like red, yellow, blue, and violet are all being absorbed by the chlorophyll, but the green light is not, and that's why we see the green light coming out. Okay, so now let's talk about the electron transport chain in the thylakoid membrane. So what you can see here is we have on the leftmost side, we have what we call photosystem 2. Photosystem 2 is actually the photosystem that takes place first, which is kind of a weird naming system, because you would probably want to name photosystem 1, the one that comes first, but we call it photosystem 2. The reason for this is it was actually discovered second, so this was named photosystem 1, and then after this was discovered and they found that, oh, this comes earlier, then they named it photosystem 2. So kind of a tricky naming system. But the major thing about photosystem 2 is that it directly absorbs sunlight. And pretty much what it does is it absorbs this sunlight, and then if you remember we said it energizes those electrons. So I think they have a nice visual here. Yeah. So, right, like the photosystem 2, the photon kind of provides the energy for the electron to be excited, right? Then it moves through, then we have an excited electron with a lot of energy. It moves through the electron transport chain, and then that creates ATP. Then we have photosystem 1. Now, photosystem 1 does the same thing. It takes a photon, which powers the movement of the electron upwards, gives it, energy, and then that is used to create NADPH. So go back here, you can see the same diagram. Photosystem 2 takes in energy from the sun, powers these two electrons. These two electrons are going to move through the electron transport chain. And remember that we said in cell respiration, the movement of these electrons actually powers the pumping of hydrogen ions. In this case, it also does that because, it still uses the ATP synthase to make energy, or ATP. So that's why it needs this hydrogen ion gradient. So as the electrons move through the first electron transport chain, they pump hydrogens from the stroma into the thylakoid. And then those electrons end up in photosystem 1. They're energized again because of the sun. And then they pass through the second photosystem, creating NADPH. So again, that's shown here. You can see that the NADPH, those two electrons are creating NADPH. You have the high hydrogen ion concentration in the thylakoid because of the pumping from the electron transport chain. Then these diffuse out through these hydrogen ions diffuse out through the ATP synthase, and this ends up in the creation of ATP. So now let's talk a little bit about the splitting of water, right? So remember that we kind of let's see, right? So here, right, we have the photon which powers the electron, and then the electron moves through this entire cycle. But the thing is, after the electron is powered, we actually have a molecule with a positive charge now because it just lost an electron. So photosystem 2, after it gives up its electron to photosystem 1, it suddenly loses an electron. And this is what we call this molecule, which is now has a positive charge. We call it P680 plus, or photosystem 2 plus. And this molecule is just named because obviously its molecule is photosystem 2, and it lost an electron, so now it has a positive charge. Now, the interesting thing about this molecule, or PS2 plus, is that it's actually the, I guess you could say, almost the strongest oxidizing agent in the world. In any organic molecule, PS2 plus is the strongest oxidizing molecule. And this means that, if you will, its craving for an electron is so strong that it will literally do anything to get that electron. So in fact, what it settles for is it settles for the splitting of water. So what it's actually going to do, it's going to take this water, the sun is going to split it into the oxygen gas, a hydrogen ion, and electron. The electron is going to be reused in the light reactions. The hydrogen ion is going to be pumped into here, and then the oxygen is going to be released from the plant. Yeah, that is the light reactions. So, quick summary, takes place in the thylakoid membrane of the chloroplast. You have photosystem 2, which energizes the electron. It also splits water to get that electron back. And this creates the oxygen gas, and it also creates some hydrogen ions that are used in the hydrogen gradient. This hydrogen ion gradient is also created by the movement of the electron through the electron transport chain, which pumps hydrogen ions in. Then you can also have photosystem 1, which is going to, again, get light energy, power up that electron that it got from here, and use that to create NADPH. Then finally, the hydrogen ions that have accumulated in here are going to move out into the stroma, which is going to cause the creation of ATP. So that is how the light reactions work. So does anybody have any question on the light reaction? Okay, so it looks like we're all good. So let's get to, oh, wait. Okay, so let's get to the dark reactions. So the dark reactions, remember, are not dependent on sunlight. They don't really involve sunlight. So this is where CO2 is converted into glucose, and it uses the energy that it got from the ATP and NADPH from the light reactions. It can occur in the dark, and it takes place in the stroma, which is kind of like the cytoplasm of the inner part of the chloroplast. So let's look at the dark reactions. So the dark reactions are the Calvin cycle. If you remember from our discussions on cell respiration, we talked about the Krebs cycle, which takes acetyl-CoA and it produces ATP, NADH, FADH2, and CO2 as waste. The dark reactions actually take in CO2 and produce a molecule called G3P, or glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. This, or 2-glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate molecules, or just G3P for short, can be used to create glucose and other sugars. Okay, so let's look at this in a little bit more detail. The Calvin cycle, no, you do not need to memorize this, but you should memorize the inputs and the outputs. So the inputs are 3 CO2 molecules. 3 CO2 molecules will create 1 glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. This is really important. Remember that. You need 3 CO2 molecules to create 1 glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and you need 6 CO2 molecules to create 2 glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate molecules, which can be combined to create 1 glucose. So in the end, you need 6 CO2 to create 1 glucose, and you need 3 CO2 to create 1 G3P. Another really important thing is, they don't show it here, but there is an enzyme that is very, very, very important in the dark reactions called Rubisco. Rubisco stands for ribulose bisphosphate phosphorylase or something like, or carboxylase or something like that. This enzyme is like really, really, really important for photosynthesis. In fact, it's actually 70% of the enzymes in the world. So it's very, very important as an enzyme. we can't, just to answer your question, we can't really take a break because there's a lot of information that we need to cover, and we only have like 40 minutes left of class, so we're not going to take a break. Yeah. If you want to take a break, you can always do so. Feel free. You can always just watch back what you missed on the recording that will be posted on our YouTube channel after. Okay, so continuing on, we were talking about Rubisco and how important it was. It's 70% of the enzyme in the world. Now, this enzyme is really, really important, and its function is to take this CO2 that we have and convert it into the first molecule of the Calvin cycle called 3-phosphoglyceric acid. You don't have to know that. Just remember that Rubisco is the first enzyme involved with the Calvin cycle, and it's a very, very important enzyme. Okay. So just a summary of photosynthesis, right? It takes place in the chloroplast and the stroma with the thylakoid membrane. That's where the light-dependent reactions take place. They need energy from the sun. They split water to create oxygen. They create ATP and NADPH, which is then used in the Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reactions in the stroma, which use CO2, and I don't think they use water. Or no, wait, they do use water. Yeah, they do use water, and they will create glucose. So yeah, that is the main part of photosynthesis. Okay. Now I have some questions that we can do. So this is just a diagram of the chloroplast. Just as a note, the grana are all connected by a structure called the lamella, which are kind of just like bridges. The lamella kind of have no other function except connecting all the grana and kind of providing structure to the inside of the chloroplast. Okay, so the first question. This equation, I'll say that a little bit. So this equation, sunlight plus 6 water plus 6 CO2 creates glucose, oxygen. So what does this equation represent? Just type your answers in the chat when you have them. So good job to all of those who got it. The answer here was photosynthesis, or C. The way you can tell, remember that sunlight is used in photosynthesis. 6 water, 6 carbon dioxide are always the reactants for photosynthesis. Remember that plants will take in carbon dioxide and produce glucose and oxygen. Yeah. So what is energy? Again, type your answers in the chat. Okay, so the answer here was A. This is kind of like a trip back to one of our earlier lectures, almost like the first one, I believe. So if you remember, energy is just the ability to do work. Photosynthesis, the earth, or photosynthesis is a process. The earth is matter and mass. Remember that energy does not have any mass, so it couldn't be the earth. Again, energy does not have any mass, so it can't be the sun. So for that reason, it has to be A, or the ability to do work. Okay, next question. Energy is never created or destroyed. It is only transferred from one thing to another. True or false? Right, so the answer here was true. This is one of the principles of thermodynamics. Energy never created or destroyed. Mass is never created or destroyed. You can only transfer it from one thing to another. So it was A. Okay, what is an autotroph? Just realized that there was a double answer on this question. So if your answer is the double answer, then choose both. If it's not, then just choose either A or C. All right, so the answer here was the double one, B and D. An animal that eats out of a trough. No. An organism that makes its own food. Remember that auto, just in general, auto means self. So remember self, like autotroph, it's making its own food. So yeah, B and D are the answer. And then an organism that eats using its mouth, that would be characteristic of a heterotroph, which remember are ones that, or animals that kind of have to move around to eat. So the answer here was B and D. Okay, next question. Where in the cell does photosynthesis take place? All right, so the answer here was C, the chloroplast. Remember that we said the nucleus is involved with storage of DNA. The mitochondria are involved with creating energy, are creating ATP from sugars. The chloroplasts are involved with photosynthesis, which means they create sugars, and then the cytoplasm is just the fluid that everything floats around. So then next, what are the two reactions that take place in the process of photosynthesis? Okay, so the answer here was B. Um, so intermediate reaction, beginning reaction for A, we never learned about such. For C, the Krebs cycle and glycolysis, those are for cell respiration. And then D, respiration and exhalation, those are how we breathe. So B is the correct answer. 7, what is chemosynthesis? All right, so it seemed like this was a tricky question, but the answer was A, the process of making chemicals into chemical energy. So remember that chemo just means chemicals and synthesis means to make. So making chemicals into chemical energy. So B, the process of changing the cell. I don't know, that doesn't really make any sense. C, the process of moving electrons. That's a function of the electron transport chain, and we didn't really learn about any terms to talk about the moving of electrons. And then the process of linking two things together is just a bond. So A, chemosynthesis, was the best answer. So next, where does the process of glycolysis take place? All right, so this is a trip back to cell respiration. The answer is cytoplasm. Remember that glycolysis taking place in the cytoplasm, the Krebs cycle, as well as the electron transport chain, or oxidative phosphorylation takes place in the mitochondria. Nucleus stores DNA, and the chloroplast is where photosynthesis takes place. Next question. What step of cellular respiration is the majority of the energy produced? Okay, so the answer here was D. Key terms here, it's the step of cell respiration, where the majority of energy is produced. It's not photosynthesis, it's cell respiration. So A, the Calvin cycle, that's photosynthesis. B, light reactions, also photosynthesis. But C, the Krebs cycle is part of cell respiration, but it doesn't produce the majority of the energy. The majority of energy is produced in D, the electron transport chain, because that is where oxidative phosphorylation occurs. So the next question. Now we have another equation where glucose plus 6 oxygen is turned into 6 water molecules, 6 CO2, and ATP. So this equation represents what process? All right, so the answer here was B, cell respiration. We can tell because it's using up glucose, producing ATP, which is very characteristic of cell respiration. Okay, next question. What are the reactants in photosynthesis? Okay, so the answer here was A. So remember that in our equation, we said that carbon dioxide and water will form oxygen and glucose. C could also be an answer with sunlight or water, but it's not the best answer. It's best to say that carbon dioxide and water are the reactants, and oxygen and glucose are the products. So that's why C is not the best answer, even though it is somewhat correct. And then D, oxygen and glucose, that is for respiration. Okay, so question 12. There's three more after this. So what are the products of cellular respiration? So if you remember, our cellular respiration equation is that oxygen and glucose make carbon dioxide and water, therefore the answer is C. So a great way to remember this, like what is what, just remember that animals, when we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. Animals, we also are going to make glucose, or we're going to use glucose, while plants are going to make, or sorry, plants are going to, yeah, make glucose. So yeah, so that's a great way to remember this. So, and remember that when we, uh, right, so the answer here would be C, or carbon dioxide and water, because of the products. Okay, a student is collecting the gas given off from a bright plant in bright sunlight at a temperature of 27 degrees Celsius. What gas would the student be collecting? Okay, so the answer here was A, or oxygen. And remember that plants uh, breathe in CO2 and breathe out oxygen. Animals breathe in oxygen and give off CO2, so therefore 13 would be A because he's giving off oxygen gas. So plants and animals exchange materials through the process of photosynthesis and respiration. Which of these statements is true about the way these two processes are related? So the answer here was D. Remember that I said earlier how the reactants and the products of photosynthesis and cell respiration are the same, and the reactants of photosynthesis and the reactants of cell respiration are opposites, and the products and photosynthesis and the products of cell respiration are opposites. So final question, what does the chloroplast do during the process of photosynthesis? Okay, so this question was interesting, but the answer here would probably be, I would say B. And the reason for that is because the chloroplast is directly involved with absorbing of energy from the sunlight. So in that sense, it does move the energy into the cell from the sun. The chloroplast does not store water. That's the function of the vacuole. C controls cellular activities. That's the function of the nucleus. And then transport sugars through the cell. Generally, that just happens through diffusion. There's nothing really transporting it. Sometimes, as we said, it will be transported in vesicles, but in this case, that's not going to happen. So there's one more topic in photosynthesis that we have to talk about, and that is, okay, so remember we talked about carbon fixation. We talked about carbon fixation, which is carried out by Rubisco. That's that big enzyme. So you don't have to worry about this. You don't have to worry about that. Okay, so something, however, can go wrong with this Rubisco, and that is when we have photorespiration. So just breaking down the word photorespiration, we see that photo means light, and respiration, like cellular respiration, is taking in oxygen. And that's weird, right? So sometimes what actually happens is the Rubisco will, instead of adding CO2 and fixing CO2, it'll actually bind to oxygen. And so what actually, like, why would this happen? And the reason for this is during conditions of low CO2 concentration and high oxygen concentration, what actually happens is the Rubisco will be more likely to bind to the oxygen if there's a very high oxygen concentration. So this product, when oxygen binds to Rubisco, what actually happens is this oxygen cannot be used in the Calvin cycle. So, what actually happens is we actually start to lose organic material. So because that, those molecules cannot be regenerated, we kind of just start wasting, organic matter from the plant. And this is actually called photorespiration. It occurs in the light, it creates, or it uses O2, and it produces CO2 and oxygen, or CO2 and water, just like cellular respiration does. So because of this process, we have different, we can differentiate plants into three types. The first is C3 plants. C3 plants, shown here, kind of are normal plants, if you will. So when you go outside, like now, and you're not in a desert, most likely the plants that you see outside are probably C3 plants. Many trees in deciduous forests, which are very common in America, those are C3 plants. And so what they do is they use photosynthesis, and because it's not so hot and dry outside, because they're kind of in a forest, they get a normal amount of rainfall, they don't really have photorespiration occur much, or photorespiration happen that often. So these C3 plants kind of live in climates where photorespiration is not a big issue. They just do the photosynthesis that we talked about. Now, there's two other types of plants, C4 plants and CAM plants. So these plants in their cells keep high CO2 concentrations, specifically for Rubisco, to make sure it does not bind to oxygen. So what actually happens, so the C3 pathway is used by all plants, but some other plants like C4 and CAM plants have these extra pathways of photosynthesis to make sure that their Rubisco is not binding to CO2, because in these hot, dry climates, you actually have a large accumulation of oxygen in the cells. So the C4 pathway, let's talk about that first. So if you remember what I said when we were talking about like where photosynthesis takes place, I said it specifically takes place in the mesophyll cells. Now, this is true for the C3 plants, that carbon fixation and all of that takes place in the mesophyll cells. But in these C4 plants, what actually happens is another reaction takes place in the mesophyll cells, and there's another set of cells called the bundle sheath cells. The bundle sheath cells are in C4 plants. This is actually where the photosynthesis and the Calvin cycle will take place. The mesophyll cells contain this extra pathway. So in this pathway, we have another important enzyme. So remember that for Calvin cycle, we use Rubisco to catalyze the first step. In this case, it's Pep Carboxylase. Pep Carboxylase is really important, and what it does is Pep Carboxylase has no affinity or does not want to bind to oxygen at all. So what it's going to do instead is it's going to bind to carbon dioxide even at very low concentrations of CO2. And so through that pathway, we create something called malate. Malate kind of stores that CO2, and then it transfers it to the bundle sheath cells. And then once it moves to the bundle sheath cells, it it gets stored in the vacuole. And then once the plants need it, they take out the malate and they convert it into CO2, which can be used in the Calvin cycle. The problem with this is it invests 12 more ATP per glucose that is created. So while it's not worth, just doing it this normally, it is worth it to do it under high sunlight conditions or very dry conditions, because it'll allow the plant to not undertake photorespiration. And you can pretty much just think of photorespiration as a complete waste. You never want to do photorespiration. So examples of plants with C4, the C4 pathway that we talked about are corn, sugarcane, and crabgrass. Those are the main ones. Now, let's talk about the other pathway, CAM pathway. So for the CAM pathway, they use crusulation acid metabolism. That's what CAM stands for. So plants at night, pretty much at night, is much cooler than it is in the daytime. So this CAM pathway uses something called temporal separation. Temporal separation, temporal means time. So it actually separates its, the reactions of photosynthesis based on time. So we have to talk about another important part of the plant, and that's called the stomata. So the stomata is on the leaf, and it facilitates gas exchange. So they're microscopic, they're like 1 cell thick, and they pretty much allow CO2 to exit the cell and oxygen to enter the cell. So cells generally keep their stomata open to allow CO2 to enter and for oxygen to exit. The reason why, we can go back to the reason why oxygen actually accumulates in these C3 plants at very high temperatures is because they don't really open their stomata often when they're doing photosynthesis. So because what's going to happen is some of that CO2 is actually going to leave, and they don't want any CO2 to leave. They want to keep their CO2 inside. So what's actually going to happen is you're going to have oxygen accumulate in cells. So because of this, CAM plants have evolved to open their stomata at night when it's not as hot outside, and there's also more water outside. Because when it's really, really hot, the stomata, or when it's very, very hot, we know that water can evaporate much easier. So when it's really, really hot, the plants are going to lose water much faster. So that's why they close their stomata during the day when it's hot, and they open it at night when it's not. So that's the main thing of the CAM pathway. So this is really, really important. Remember this for the alternate pathways. C4 works by altering the location of initial CO2 fixation. It initially occurs in the mesophyll cells, and then that malate gets transferred to the bundle sheath cells for actual photosynthesis. And then CAM plants work by altering the time of initial CO2 fixation based on the stomatal opening and closing. All of the plants still use the C3 cycle, but some have these C4 adaptation and CAM adaptation. Okay, so that is it for photosynthesis. We covered a lot today, as we did last class. So if you do have any questions, feel free to contact me. I'll be posting the resources we used in class today, as well as the YouTube video later today when I get the chance, or maybe tomorrow. Yeah, that's it for today. And I will see you guys next week. If there's any questions, you can ask them now.